master tip this month is about how to keep the knees healthy. Anytime we do postures like tree pose or the lotus variations or lotus pose itself, it is easy to be hard on the knees. The knee only safely works when it is either extending or flexing or somewhere in between. This is very different than a joint like the hips, which can still move forward and back, flexing and extending, but can also externally rotate and internally rotate. Also very different than the shoulders that can actually brachiate and move in a huge range of motion. This matters because when we do postures like lotus or the lotus variations or even tree pose in half lotus, it can be very hard on the knee because we end up putting pressure on the knee by rotating the hip, okay? So if the hips are tight and they do not externally rotate, what ends up happening is pressure can go into the knee, basically by taking a twisting motion in the knee. When we want the rotation always to be 100% in the hips, okay? So the easiest way to go about this when getting into tree pose is to make sure that the knee joint is as closed as possible. So your knee is as bent or as flexed as possible before you start to rotate the hip. So the safest way to get into a tree pose or a lotus pose is to bring the heel as close to the body as possible so the knee joint is closed, and then externally rotate the hip. Okay? This is very different than reaching for your foot and pulling on your foot when the knee joint is more open, because the pressure then can come into the knee instead of the rotation happening in the hip. If you feel any pressure or pinching at all in the knees, you should back off of the postures that you feel the pressure in. You might feel pain or a pinching sensation either on the outside of the knee or on the inside of the knee, but either way, you do not want to push into that feeling. Postures that need the hip to externally rotate, like lotus or tree or lotus variations, they require that the knees are healthy and that the knees stay safe. No posture is worth damaging your knees. So be careful and make sure you get into each and every lotus position carefully and methodically by bringing the foot as close to the body as possible, closing the knee joint as much as possible, and then taking the movement or the external rotation in the hip only.